Subjectivity and reality. The final step that remains to be taken is that by which the reality of this universe must be discovered, whose transcendental origin we have seen. It must lead to the solution of the problem that all transcendental philosophy raises, that, that Hegel's phenomenology further amplifies by identifying the constituting subject with the philosopher's self. What ontological status should be given to a world that analysis has revealed is constituted by a subject? Having arrived by regression at the pure principle that accounts for the real, this real that had to be saved, we risk losing it with the essential character of reality. It is this peril that imposes on us a final task, that of descending back towards the world of mixtures, as one would say in a universe of Platonic thought. To verify whether this descent attempted by Hegel from the Wissenschaft der Logik was not a mystification, whether its reality was not that entirely negative of a lie or an error, whether the mixtures in which Hegelian thought was deployed in the theories of art, religion, law, and history do not constitute the most coherent but the most illusory myths. The critique made explicit by Marx in his early works was precisely the critique of this descent, of the reality to which it claimed to lead. The true starting point for Marx of the Hegelian system is to be sought not in the first pages of the Phenomena of Spirit, but rather in the last ones, the circle by which the beginning of phenomenology is justified by the end, reciprocally, is cut by Marx in favor of absolute knowledge, such that knowledge from Marx is that in which he sees the element in which the different moments of this dialectic move, whereas knowledge for Hegel is the way in which consciousness exists for itself and also the way in which an object can exist. In Hegel, the only objective relationship that is possible to manifest in the reality of the world is the subjective relationship of the knower to the known. It is in the universal environment of absolute knowledge, which is the knowledge of a subject, that the reality of that which for the subject is not itself affirmed. The reality of the thinker and the thought and their opposition is therefore only the universal reality of the thinker themselves, who is enveloped in their own relationship to the object. As the norm of themselves, the thinker will necessarily henceforth be the norm of what presents itself to them, in the form of opposition and in the form of the most profound exteriority. What in the universe presents itself immediately as non-human reality will be caught in a movement which, by turning it around, will be revealed as the most profoundly human reality, but then also subject to the pathos of alienation. The posited being of alienation is that the human being objectifies himself in a non-human way. This is why, in his two essential forms of nature and objectivity, alienation will never be able to find the true consistency of an effective reality. And this illusion in which it will claim to realize itself will only manifest that it is itself illusory, the lie to which it wants to give a status of reality. It is the reverse of this lie that it is itself, a lie of the alienated world. Alienation is itself lie of lie. The objectivity which reveals its being there in the immobile element is therefore false objectivity. It is only the exteriorized self-consciousness. But what could this objectification mean? If the objective were not found in the determination of its being, if there did not already exist to limit self-consciousness an objective reality in which it projects itself, which it cannot any longer subsequently find itself. The movement of alienation and objectivity has meaning only if objectivity is already constituted. To be a lie, the lie implies a certain truth, at least its truth of being as a lie. Similarly, Hegel's nature does not only have the defect of being an illusory nature, but also of being an illusion contradictory with itself. If nature exists only for the grace of the subject who alienates himself in the non-human universe, then how can we understand this exteriorization, if not as a certain relationship between a human nature and a non-human nature, both already constituted even before this movement? Alienation only takes on meaning and content between two natures of which it realizes an illusory mediation. A being that does not have its nature outside itself does not participate in the being of nature. Moments of reality never unfold for Hegel except in the abstract universe of the thinker. That the movement of Alphabung is itself illusory. The meaning of Alphabung is the suppression of these tricks by which the various alienations of man constantly arouse. But the disappearance of these illusions is itself an illusion. What it should cause to vanish subsists, immobile, preserved in the universal element of knowledge. As long as we have not reached a concrete reality where the suppression will have the reality of an effective disappearance, as long as we have not conceived of the Aufhebung as a revolution in history, the different moments will subsist enclosed in the totality of knowledge. Morality will doubtless suppress private law, a civil society, the family, but in the totality of the state and in the universal history, they have received the status of elements, of effective realities. They have become existences and modes of being which do not remain isolated. In the unreal world of Hegel, once absolute knowledge has been attained, the movement of suppressing unreality has itself the destiny of being unreal, maintaining in the unreal reality that which has the mission of making definitively vanish. The only work that Hegel knows is abstract spiritual work. It would be easy to reproach Marx for the ambiguity of his critical analysis, in which he sought, by following Hegel's dialectic, to give rise to the contradictions of his thought. Marx seems to make the two antithetical reproaches to Hegel. He objects first that the objectivity and nature which find a place in his philosophy are only a false objectivity and a false nature, and an alienation, that is to say, illusory expression of a subjectivity. For Marx, Hegelian nature would be too human a nature, at the same time, for not being able to reduce this alienation, for allowing it to subsist even in the realization of the spirit. Nature would now be too far removed from the human and inaccessible to a work and a suppression which are actually real. In fact, this contradiction in criticism is not to be attributed to Marx but to Hegel. Hegel, who, after having denounced the misfortune of consciousness, which does not recognize itself in what is, however, nothing other than itself, subsequently makes its absolute knowledge the internalized memory of these misfortunes. It is as if this knowledge itself were the realization of happiness. It is doubtless Hegel that Marx was aiming at when he spoke of a good man who thought that one would no longer drown if one stopped believing in gravity. If it is true that the whole of Hegelian philosophy must be interpreted as a subjectivism, if the totality of being is reduced for Hegel to being an absolute knowledge, then alienation cannot be an illusion of subjectivity, since it alone really exists. But this alienation cannot be definitively resolved either, since it will never do anything but integrate itself into a knowledge that will remain it is its own known. Because being is subjectivity, there can be no real objectivity. But because this subjectivity is knowledge, nature and the world will always have, despite all Aufhebung, the exteriority and the subsistence of the known object. Marx's double critique is not contradictory with itself, it only reflects and explains for itself the ambiguity of the Hegelian texts. By following Hegel step by step, it manifests its contradictions. But all of Marx's critique is only valid once the postulate is admitted that absolute knowledge must be interpreted in a purely subjectivist sense, that the universe in which the philosopher's thought moves is the world of universal abstraction. It must be admitted that the philosopher, by identifying themselves with the constituent self, sets themselves up as the norm of the alienated world. When we seek to resolve this question about the nature of absolute knowledge, the reference to Hegel's text leads us to embarrassment. We find ourselves in the presence of two series of texts, one of which shows in the realization of the spirit the exact adequacy of subjectivity to objectivity, the other of which describes, on the contrary, nature as a fall of subjectivity out of itself, that the advent of knowledge is the vanishing of this painful moment. This last series of texts is especially to be found in the Phenomenology and the Encyclopedia. We see there the passage from the pure idea to its alienation in a nature where it is lost. It is a birth that nature never acquires with a true autonomy. It is the destiny of the idea to lose itself in something whose truth is not to be anything other than itself. If knowledge is lost in nature, explains the Phenomenology, it is not because an irreducible non-knowledge opposes it, but because it knows itself negatively in its limit. To know oneself to be limited is already to sacrifice oneself, already to escape oneself into beyond that is not it. And it is thus that the spirit alienates itself from itself and presents its movement of becoming spirit in the form of the free contingent event. And since the spirit bears the responsibility for its own alienation, it may also owe only to itself to recover itself and its identity. It may completely suppress its exteriorization in nature. to return from this foreign country to the native land of self-equality. And in this movement, nature never achieves independence. It is that which can constantly be suppressed, and can find its truth and its essence only in this being other, which is for it the spirit. This is why nature will not know history, this movement of liberation of self by self. This is also why it will make room only for contingency and never for freedom. What can be discovered in this form of alienation? Not free rationality, but chance, contingency, disorder. The sensitive beings in whom the laws of reason are incarnated present an irrational and unstable play on the scale of contingent magnitude between moments of the concept rather than these moments themselves. Incapable of accessing the autonomy of freedom, nature knows only this parity of independence that are chance and the irrational, but this completely external form of activity is at bottom only the worst of passivities, and that which is not yet denounced itself, and which still ignores that it depends closely on the sole activity of the mind. All these texts only offer Marxist thought a broader scope, and tend to show the subjectivist character of absolute knowledge as we have identified it. But there is another series of texts where Hegel insists on the very real objectivity of this realization of the spirit, where far from being a suppression of the objective, it is an apotheosis of it. Absolute knowledge is not a totalitarianism of certainty, but certainty in it reveals itself as being one with the truth. The idea on which the Wissenschaft or logic closes is the realized unity of the theoretical and the practical, of the subjective and the objective. Are these affirmations the simple contradictories of the text to which we have referred just now? But these protests, does Hegel not bring himself to a trial in a tendency towards his own subjectivism? Does he deny in a thesis without foundation what he is obliged to admit obscurely and in spite of himself as hypothesis? In fact, it is this whole formed by these two series of texts which must be examined at once. Marx made himself look good by wanting to know only the first of those which we have seen are for Hegel completely irrational. It is the trace of the concept, which means that it can be known, within certain limits, by science and philosophy of nature. Moreover, important texts by Hegel show how this unity of his thought can be ensured, thereby proving that this ultimate synthesis is not the artificial and abstract unity built up after the fact, but rather the reconciliation of the thinker with themselves and their positive victory over the negative moments of the contradiction. The most characteristic passage in this respect is perhaps that with which the Wissenschaft or logic ends, and where Hegel attempts to show the passage from the pure idea, from the absolute idea, to nature. He thus answers very precisely the problem posed to us by Marxist criticism. Once the subjectivity of thought has reached its foundation in a concept which knows that the world is itself, is there still room for subjectivity? At this extreme level of dialectical development, it is precisely the case that there is no longer, strictly speaking, a dialectic. Granted, the subjectivity of thought had led to the objectivity of true knowledge by a dialectical process, and the same process had given rise to the life of subjective and the personal purpose. But at this level, there can no longer be a dialectic, since absolute knowledge, since the idea, realized totalities in which the different moments of being other are absorbed and disappear. Outside of this total reality, it is quite impossible to discover otherness, where, even if only for an instant, it could lose itself in order to discover itself again. Without this negative moment of being other, there is no dialectic. There cannot be a question of here of a, there cannot be a question here of passage from the idea to nature of a being become. It is in itself that the idea must discover nature. But since the idea already realized cannot become that which is only one of its elements, and since therefore neither in it nor outside it the idea can find what will change it into nature, therefore it is itself, by itself, which must become such. Or rather, it is as this term of becoming which encloses in itself the notion of the negative. It is the idea which is of itself nature, insofar as the idea poses itself as the absolute unity of the pure notion and its reality. It is as totality in this form, nature. And far from being this middle torn between the necessity of the idea descended to it and the contingent chance of matter, instead of being this platonic mixture where being, to its misfortune, becomes porous to non-being, rather, nature is the same reality, the same freedom as the absolute idea itself. It is not the fault of freedom into the mystified universe of contingency, but rather the movement by which the idea frees itself and by which it also affirms this liberation. Because of this freedom, which is that of the idea absolutely sure of itself and resting in itself, the form of its immediate termination is itself absolutely free. To reconcile these texts and those in which nature reveals itself as the passion of the idea and the negative movement of alienation, it is enough to show how the same term, nature, receives two meanings, which are not contradictory, but which envelop each other. Nature is indeed the environment of universal contingency, in which consciousness, through its work, through its patience, and through its pain, learns to recognize itself. It constitutes the phenomenal field in which unfold the experiences of consciousness and the history of consciousness. This field has the double meaning of being, for empirical consciousness, the inexhaustible domain which never presents itself to it except under particular aspects, and which encloses in its silence the meaning of what it is and its destiny. And for the philosopher who operates a transcendental regression, a form of consciousness which has not yet recognized itself as such, and which little by little is astonished by the happiness of finding itself in what was most foreign to it. The transcendental destiny of this nature is therefore to disappear. But when the moment is reached when the constituting self asserts itself as absolute knowledge, what is discovered is not the unreality of the objective, not the universal hold of the subject on the real, but on the contrary, the identity of the subjective and the objective, the impossibility of dissociating them. That is, if nature, in the empirical sense, is indeed only a constituted universe, objectivity is, for that reason, not excluded from the transcendental, but rather this absolute knowledge, which the phenomenology of spirit defined above all in relation to the subject, logic now defines as the concept, Begriff, which knows itself and has it as its object only itself as absolute, objective, as well as speculative. This unity of the objective and the subjective in absolute knowledge, it is not similar to that Schellingian absolute whose formalism Hegel denounced by showing it in it the naivety of the void in knowledge. It is not, in fact, for Hegel, a questioning of this unity of the objective and the subjective in absolute knowledge. It is not similar to the Schellingian absolute whose formalism Hegel denounced by showing in it the naivety of the void in knowledge. It is not, in fact, for Hegel, a question of placing at the foundation of being a principle from which the subject and the object can arise, as by the symmetrical movement of a pendulum. It is not with the brutality of a pistol shot that the absolute must manifest itself for him. Rather, if the supreme moment encloses the subjective and the objective in the same unity, it is not by virtue of a starting postulate, but because at the end of the phenomenological regression, foundation of the real has revealed itself not as a substance, but as knowledge, and because the notion of knowledge has meaning only because it envelops that of the subject and the object in inseparable unity. The presence of the objective in the absolute idea which logic leads to is therefore not a postulate. That it is justified by the point of arrival of the phenomenology has no other meaning than the realization of this unity. The two works converge towards the same result. The point we had reached by following the phenomenology of spirit was therefore not that of extreme subjectivism, not the knowledge of a subject who would have no other object than themselves, but rather, confronted with the absolute idea as it appears at the end of logic, this knowledge in which we have seen the transcendental subjects express themselves. This knowledge is the unity of the subjective and the objective.